Residential sales comparison and income approaches, page 46. Of course, it may be very possible in either example that the buyer for one property would not be interested in the other property. Thus, while the properties might be comparable, they would likely not be competitive. Competitive properties. Competitive properties are those that compete head to head. In other words, a potential buyer for one property would also be interested in the competitive property. These properties are not necessarily physically identical. A buyer might be interested in many styles and ages of houses as long as they are located in a particular area. For example, consider a subject property located in a particular subdivision where there are various styles and designs of houses considered competitive because it would attract the same, not similar, buyer who desired or limited his choices to this particular subdivision for whatever reason. The motivation could be schools, proximity to services, etc. But a competitive property does not necessarily need to be located in the same development or on the same street. A property could be considered competitive anytime it would be considered attractive to the same buyer. Comparable and competitive properties. There would be very little argument that the ideal data to be used for comparable analysis would represent properties that are both comparable to and competitive with the subject property. Properties that are as similar physically, locationally, and / or legally as possible and would attract the same buyer. When relevant, comparable, and competitive data is plentiful, there is little need for the appraiser to venture outside of the market area for his analysis or to instead use a 1 1/2 story house to compare with a 2-story subject. In some assignments, there may be readily available comparable and competitive data for subject properties and markets. Even more ideal is when the subject can be compared to a property that is physically identical and located next door with no differences whatsoever. What a perfect world that would be. To summarize this discussion, appraisers will select and evaluate comparable data by employing the following rationale. Identify properties that are both comparable and competitive. Identify properties that are competitive but not comparable. Identify properties that are comparable but not competitive. An argument could be made as to which of the latter two should be identified and evaluated first: competitive or comparable properties. Since most analysis focuses on location, it is very common and logical that the appraiser will evaluate competitive properties from the page 47. subject market before going out in distance to identify comparable but not particularly competitive properties. Ideally, the data chosen will reflect the most recent, nearest, and physically similar when compared to the subject property. But the quality and quantity of the data available as well as any assignment conditions will dictate this rationale. Client requirements, such as Fannie Mae requirements and guidelines, will be discussed in Chapter 7. The initial choice of data to be used in the sales comparison approach analysis is a decision that requires the appraiser's sound judgment skill. Experience is required to develop this skill. In many assignments, the appraiser will select several properties for his analysis, depending on the assignment and the quantity of data available. The initial gathering of data could exceed that which will eventually be used in his valuation analysis. Once the data has been identified, it can be organized in a manner where the relevance and differences between the properties and the subject can be more easily recognized. Data array. The data array or data array grid is a popular and helpful method of data organization. With the subject and comparable data arranged and displayed in this manner, the appraiser can more easily observe the amount of data that has been collected and, foremost, the comparability and quality of the data. The data array grid should not be misunderstood as a method of adjusting comparable properties. That comes later. The process is purely for the purpose of displaying the data in a way that allows the appraiser to determine quantity and quality. As a starting point to the analysis process, the data array can reveal areas of differences where analysis must later take place for the necessity of adjustments. In some assignments, relevant data can be plentiful, and the data collection and organization process is rather simple. Of course, this also requires the appraiser to be fairly familiar with the particular market and the transactions that have taken place. USPAP does not place an obligation on the appraiser to use and analyze a specific number of comparables. Rule number 1-4A of USPAP simply requires the appraiser to analyze such comparable sales data as are available. A minimum of 3 comparables are most usually gathered, analyzed, and presented in keeping with the regulations and requirements of many clients and intended users, which will be further discussed in Chapter 7. Location is an important aspect of an appraiser's analysis. For this reason, competitive properties within the subject's market are first evaluated. As a next step, appraisers may then go outside the subject's market to identify comparable properties that may not be necessarily competitive. The use of data array grids helps appraisers recognize the quantity and quality of the collected data. It is not meant as a method of adjusting comparable properties. Extra note, it means you can put them together, stack a list of numbers.